Subscribe and click the bell icon for the latest updates and notifications from the Indian Express.
One of the things during your term, I think, which can be counted as a pretty big achievement during your stint was this revival of Quad. How did this change come about in Australia, and what was your engagement like with the Indian government, Indian diplomat, which led to this formation, revival of Quad, and even taking it up to the ministerial level?
I think it's fair to say that the first round of the Quad, when it happened in 2007, it was a bit of actually an unusual beast. We didn't really do very much in small groups, you know, what in diplomat speak we call mini-laterals. By 2017, by the time we're thinking about bringing the Quad together, we're in a very different strategic environment. Not only have we by then been well on the road to articulating what we mean when we say Indo-Pacific, which is a term that we'd already been using for a decade by then, but also we were considering that there was a different way of prosecuting diplomacy. And already by that stage, trilaterals and small groupings are quite well established. So Australia, India and Japan had a trilateral that that was already underway. We were working in 2+2 formats. India itself had a number of trilateral, the RIC grouping and those sorts of things. So by 2017, it becomes a natural evolution to move to a Quad format because, of course, the 4 Quad partners have trilaterals with each other in different formations anyway. There's a clear convergence of strategic outlook. And I think that all of that became very evident to all the partners as the conversation went on. And all of us came to it, I think, at different speeds, I suppose. But it was I think, a process that every country went through where we thought about how we might bring a Quad together, what we might talk about, and then whether or not weighing it up, whether it made sense in our strategic environment. I think India went through the same process as Australia, and we all came together at that first Quad in November 2017, as you know. The way to think about the Quad is as a strategic grouping of like-minded countries. The conversations are about humanitarian and disaster relief. They're about counterterrorism. They're about cyber issues. And every iteration of the Quad, we discover more areas of common approach. I think there's a sense that in the Indo-Pacific, what we have is a contested strategic environment. We have an environment where economic power is shifting to the Indo-Pacific, and this is not just China, this is many other countries. Vietnam is growing, Bangladesh, India, obviously. So that this creates strategic flux, and that we need to find ways of building small groups that we can work with depending on the issue. So the Quad is actually a very natural grouping in that sense. I think each of us have our views about China, but I think the bottom line, I think where we all stand is that we want China to be a constructive player in the region, and we want to work well and constructively with China. And where not just China, but any country, crosses a line or oversteps a mark, we want to be able to say so as well. Of course, Prime Minister's visits tend to be great magnets for bringing together a lot of work that's been in train. In that sense, yes, of course, we've been talking about a logistics agreement for quite some time now. I've been very open, if you read my speeches, in saying that I believe that that is one of those things that will really solidify the relationship and allow us to take that strategic engagement up a step further. I mean, if you just look last year, how many engagements did we have operationally with India in the defence space? We brought our largest ever naval deployment here, AUSINDEX, for a bilateral naval exercise. India participated in a number of exercises in Australia. A logistics support agreement really just simplifies and smooths all of that. So certainly it's my hope that we'll be able to conclude that in time, but I can't predict, obviously, how these things go. But if you look at the other areas also where we are working with India in the strategic space, you know, things like cyber cooperation, counter-terrorism, people smuggling and human trafficking. These are all areas that we continue to work on.
As a person who has been watching India, the incidents and developments in India for the last 4 years, and especially in the backdrop of new legislative initiatives from the government, how do you assess Indian democracy now?
I always say that it's very dangerous water for a foreign envoy to wade into to talk about the internal dynamics of a country. But I remain an optimist on India. I believe that Indians' democracy is actually very energetic. It is very alive. India's greatest strength is the strength of its democracy and its pluralist society. And I think that that's the thing that gives this country a great deal of dynamism. So the fact that there is so much debate about government policy or legislation, I think is a good thing, is a healthy thing. And that's something I would encourage India to continue to support and to evolve.
You once said the greatest democracies would always allow uncomfortable debates in the country.
Yeah.
So do you think that is happening in India, or do you see any threat?
I think there's a very strong debate going on about issues that some people find uncomfortable. So I mean, if that is the test, then I think India is doing very well.
You talked about India and Australia being like-minded countries, democracies, following rule of law. In this kind of environment where we see protests on against CAA or what happened in Kashmir, there is a sort of people who are skeptical about the move or the internet shutdown that have happened. Do you think for Australia politically, having India as a strategic partner, does that make difficult for an Australian government to engage with India politically, and for Australian businessmen to come and set up their business if they see this kind of environment where there are protests, there is rising perception of religious intolerance? You think that makes it difficult for both the Australian government and the Australian business to do business with India?
You know, our starting point as a government, as an Australian government, is to respect the sovereignty of every country. In fact, you know, a core element of the way we see the Indo-Pacific idea is a country where sovereign countries can behave in a sovereign fashion. So we don't like being lectured to by other people, and so we're a bit, you know, not inclined to lecture others ourselves. You know, every businessman or every person will make their decision and their own judgment about how they feel about engaging with India. I think that there are two things that give India a lot of weight and credibility in the region, including in Australia. And those things are the strength of its economy and the strength of its democracy and its open society. And to the extent that those strengths remain, India will continue to be an important and credible partner in the region.
I wanted to ask on this Adani's basically interest in the coal mine thing. The government is quite supportive of Australian government. I mean, it seems it's willing to go ahead with the project as of now. But in the wake of this raging protests and the bushfire thing going on, and so many critics and protests already being on, I mean, how would you justify, I mean, in the long term, because it's not just a short-term sort of project. It's going to be several years and many more years. I mean, we're going to be there for so many years to be, so how do you defend your position on that, basically in allowing across the country?
I think that's mixing a few issues, if I may say so. The Adani mine is a very significant investment. We're a country that welcomes investment. In fact, you know, so that is a commercial decision made by the Adani Group to invest in Australia. It's one that really, both at the centre and at the state government level, has generally been welcomed because it does generate jobs and it does bring, you know, it improves the economy of that region. I won't deny that it's actually been a subject of some controversy in Australia, and it may well likely be that. I mean, climate change is a very live debate in Australia. It's a very sharp debate in Australia. But it's not for me to justify or not justify the moral value of that mine. But I can justify it in terms of the Australian government continuing to support investment where that investment is soundly and commercially based. For us to do otherwise would introduce a level of sovereign risk into investment that frankly would not be welcome in Australia or in fact by any other investors in the country.
Your view on India's stand on RCEP?
Yeah.
How do you see that, and is it good for the overall sort of, I mean, the group, so as to say? I mean, how important is India's presence in that? And
I think it's fair to say Australia and other RCEP members were generally disappointed by India's announcement at the East Asia Summit last year. Our immediate reaction and the reaction of our Prime Minister Morrison was to say the door is wide open for India to rejoin. That remains our priority. We really genuinely hope that India will rejoin RCEP. You know, the issues and concerns that India has, I think, are something that we should continue to consider, address and seek to negotiate. Australia and other RCEP members had come quite a long way to addressing those concerns with India. We recognise that this has not been an easy road for India to go on. India is, in some senses, catching up with the other countries in the region. But we really credit the Indian system for having invested the time and effort and the quality of its work in engaging with RCEP right up to that point. So, you know, India is important in RCEP not just because of the size of its economy now and the potential size of its economy, but actually, if you think about it, what is RCEP beyond being a trade agreement? It is actually regional economic integration. It is about bringing the big players of the Indo-Pacific together economically, not just strategically. And we know there's always a connection between those two points. India adds weight, it brings balance to the RCEP equation, and equally, and I have said this many times, what RCEP offers India is accelerated and you know, quite great access to 15 of the most dynamic economies in the world. So, you know, there would be benefits to India as well in joining RCEP in terms of its ability to access those economies and strengthen its economy in the process. I understand that, you know, this is not a view that's shared by everybody, but I do sincerely believe that there are ways that we can actually come out of an RCEP negotiation that is a win-win. So it is our hope that India takes a look at it. India's government has said that, you know, it will sort of keep the door a little bit ajar and consider it. And whenever India is ready, I think we're quite happy to work with India to welcome it back. This was always seen by both countries as a commercial investment made by a private company into Australia. The government interaction on the Australian side related to regulatory approvals, as it is when Australians invest in India. So, so really the government engagement was only in that context.
You've seen last 4 years how the Indian economy has performed or underperformed, if I may say so. So how does Australia, or how do you as an observer of the economic situation see this does that impact in any way Australia's engagement with India? And what does it mean for Australia?
Our understanding is that economies, and anybody who watches this, and I've watched economies not just in India but elsewhere, is that they go up and down in cycles. The trick is to always look at the trend line. And on any calculation, even if you look at the IMF's latest outlook, the trend line for India still remains strongly positive. And I think that's because the economic fundamentals in India are sound. That said, what will affect the speed and the shape of that trend line will be specific policy decisions that are made or specific events that might occur. And so those are the things that we watch to see whether it is actually getting there faster or slower. But, you know, we are great advocates in Australia for open, liberal economies, for low levels of protection, and for deep engagement in the global economy. India, I think, has an opportunity to really shape its economy, to reform it, and to move that forward into the future, to really get an economy that's strong and that is resilient into the future. And it's good to see, in fact, that the government has taken some strong steps in this respect. You know, ease of doing business is a real thing. You know, there's progress yet, there's scope yet to go, but it's actually come a long way. We are seeing more interest by Australian businesses in India. It has been a help, and this has been a surprise to me. I don't think it's very easy to define why it's been so useful. I think at some level, an ability to interpret both sides of both perspectives is something a bit easier if you understand the culture deeply. This isn't exclusive to people of Indian origin. I mean, there are ambassadors of Indian origin who may not do that so well. I think this also goes to a core diplomatic skill, which is our ability to look at the country and to look at events through the eyes of the people of the country. Certainly a lot easier if you have the language, if you are an addict for Bollywood movies, as I am, if you have all those, you know, if you bring something to it as a person, but everybody brings something. I've just found it a very comfortable place to work, very easy, of all the places I've been to, very easy to work. And I think that some level of that has to have something to do with my origins.
You have Australia on one side has decided to ban Huawei, and you have the UK and the US on the other side, and that debate is also very important within the Indian government as well. So I'm wondering what the reasoning is behind Australia's decision, and how do you think it impacts India's technology sector as well?
A fairly technical assessment we made about how to secure our 5G network. And we were the first country to really take up this question because our telecommunications companies asked us to have a look at it. So we did. We just undertook a technical assessment and formed a view that we needed to be able to secure our 5G network. We needed to ensure that all the vendors in that network were distant from any government or any other power. And that's essentially where we landed. It's not aimed at Huawei or any other company in particular. It's a judgment about the distance between a commercial provision of equipment or whatever and the ability of another government or another power to interfere. So we made that judgment. We made it entirely on technical grounds. We made it in the context of our own sovereign concerns.
I want to ask about the political will behind combating climate change in your government, especially as you see in the news what could be seen as the consequences of climate change have really, with the bushfires, really harmed the country. And I'm wondering if the perception that there's not enough political will to fight this problem from your countries, what your response to that would be?
So yes, thank you. The bushfires have been quite unprecedented in our country this year. It's normal for us to have bushfires at this time of the year, but it's certainly not normal to have what we have had. And obviously our government has worked very hard to respond to that bushfire. We are very sure that the recovery effort will happen fairly swiftly. Our Prime Minister has been very open in saying that definitely climate change is a factor in these fires. It is something I think that bears more examination. Despite all the noise and controversy around climate change in Australia, and it has always been a very controversial topic. The fact is we've had every government since 2006, 2007 in Australia of whatever political colour has had a climate change policy in place and has had an emissions reduction policy in place, as does the current government. So it is something that I'm sure will be considered down the track as we review these issues, but be in no doubt that we are very conscious of the climate aspect to these bushfires as well.
Earlier you spoke that opening up of the economy has benefited many countries, like India, Australia, both. But we are increasingly moving towards a sort of scenario where all the countries are turning inwards. A lot of tariffs are being imposed. So how do you see that scenario kind of impacting global trade, global growth?
The backbone of Australia's success has been the liberalisation of our economy. And in the past, when the world did go down the path of raising tariff walls, the sure thing we knew is that it led to slower growth globally anyway. This isn't just an ideological position. This actually is objectively something that makes a lot of sense. I think every ambassador made their choice about going on that tour. I don't want to comment about that.
Affecting greatest state of Pakistan, which Australia did. Because buying this first question was linked to the second one, because your relationship with India is much stronger. And if India is taking foreign envoys to Kashmir to explain its position, Australia would definitely be in that list.
I just wouldn't draw the link. I think Kashmir is a whole different issue. We've always been of the view that Kashmir is a bilateral issue for India and Pakistan to resolve. There's no sense in any case for Australia to sort of wade into what is really a bilateral issue. The FATF in the end is a technical group, and it is and they make their technical judgments about whether a country is meeting the requirements or is not meeting the requirements. We've landed on a technical judgment that the grey listing continued to be justified, as we did. I think it was last October was the last meeting. So we're now, of course, in that process of discussing whether there has been progress made by Pakistan towards meeting some of those requirements. As a global good citizen, what we try to do is contribute to the shaping of global peace and security, not in terms of commenting on one country's actions or another country's actions. And the reason we have credibility in contributing to global peace and security is that we're not seen as a country that goes in and takes one side or the other. We do that at the invitation of the countries, and this is why being such a key member, a member of the UN, has been such a key part of the way we look at things, because that happens with the consent of all the countries involved, and that is a very important part of the puzzle. You can't solve a problem if someone doesn't want the problem solved. I think since 2001, since 9/11, it's certainly been on our radar, this whole question about political Islam and radicalization. As Australia had been very concerned by the number of foreign fighters that went from Australia to the Middle East, particularly to fight with ISIS, it was something that was a very serious concern to us. And we have worked very hard on counter-radicalization. And you're correct that a large part of that was about working with with our Islamic communities in Australia. But one thing we've been learning as we've gone along is that the path for it's actually impossible to predict the path that leads someone to take to get to radicalization. We know that working with the communities has been helpful. We know that, for example, watching social media use and social media behaviour can also be helpful in identifying who might be radicalised, but it's not perfect. India has a very, very small number of foreign fighters. It's something that actually we look at with a little bit of admiration, and we're trying to understand what it is that's different in India to what has happened in Australia, to try to see if there are things, in fact, we can learn from India.
In 4 years, what do you count as your biggest achievement, and what is the lowest point that you see?
It's very difficult for me to point to one single great achievement. But I would actually say, for me, the overall step change in the relationship has been the big achievement. I feel my achievements have been not so much, what I've done in India as what has been happening in Australia. Australia has also begun to notice India and take India very seriously as a partner and work seriously with India. And the fact that that is actually a mutual thing has been a phenomenal achievement. I've been so delighted at it. I think for me, RCEP has been a disappointment, and I maintain hope that India will reconsider and will come back to that.